Welcome back to Capital H. I'm joined here today with Michael Fraccaro, who just retired as the Chief People Officer of Mastercard, and thrilled to have him here at Deloitte University, where he's engaging with clients in the Workforce Innovation Forum, an event that Deloitte puts on for leaders focused on talent, learning, workforce development, growth in support of broad business objectives. Michael, thank you for joining us here on Capital H, and thank you for joining us live and in person at Deloitte University.
Fantastic, and thank you for the invitation, Kyle, and to be here at the Deloitte University. My first time here, and it's an impressive facility, so very excited about it all.
Well, and following on the heels of a dream weekend at the Masters.
Absolutely, yeah, I know. What a wonderful weekend it's been.
Yeah, and no better way to cap that moment than to be here and sharing some of your experience with people who are really grappling with some tough challenges that you have led in your role as a Chief People Officer, driven really tremendous business outcomes and human outcomes for the workers and your customers more broadly. So, Michael, I thought we'd start with just helping folks understand what your career journey looked like leading into becoming a Chief People Officer.
Yeah, so my career journey is not the traditional person that's thought about going into HR and worked all the way to becoming a Chief People Officer of a big company. I started off as a high school teacher in Sydney, Australia. And after about 3.5 years, I had one of those pivotal moments where one of the senior teachers said, "Hey, Michael, have you ever thought of doing something different other than teaching?" And it was one of those moments where you could either take it as, okay, is she really giving me some feedback that I'm not really cut out for this? Or is she really inspiring me to take another path and perhaps try something different? And I did try something different. I took the optimistic path. And at that time in Australia, the government was providing a tax benefit to organizations that had a certain payroll, and they would invest it in training. And so there were a lot of these corporate training roles. So I worked for a technology company in financial services, and that just sparked a huge interest about human development, technical development, and the whole area of HR. And so that was the catalyst for pursuing a career in HR.
It's such a fascinating place to start. I've met a number of folks who have been teachers that move into the business world. And one of the things that I've always seen is they come to an organization with an incredible gift for communication, which I think when you then go through your career and become an executive, what is most important? How are you communicating with your C-suite peers? How are you communicating with the workforce? And so there's probably something to be said about this teacher to business world talent pipeline that maybe other organizations need to explore as well.
Yeah, I think it is. I think there's a piece around listening, so the communication aspect there, empathy as well, and meeting people where they are. And I think the foundation of teaching as well, we have to do a lot of preparation and planning and so forth, is a good discipline for me. So anyway, pursued the career into HR. And then from Australia, I wanted to get international experience. So I moved over to the Middle East. So I worked in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia and worked for a Saudi French bank for a couple of years. That was a big eye-opener, personally and professionally, just in terms of the cultural aspect. And this is pre-internet as well. So internet was just breaking through. So all of that. And again, it was around the learning point for me. It was around adapting to a new environment and being curious, because I think that's a theme throughout my career about needing to continually learn and being at the top of your game. Went back to Australia after a couple of years, and then within a year, I wanted to go back internationally again, and then worked for another large financial services institution in Hong Kong. And then I lived in Asia for another 12 years. And then at the end of 2012, moved to the US and joined Mastercard. And that's where I've been for the last 13 years.
Yeah. And Michael, along that journey, such a rich set of experiences internationally, countries that are having such an impact on the world, different types of organizations, different sizes, shapes, cultures, as you acknowledged. At some point along the way, you then have to think, all right, what's my next move? And within the HR domain, do I want to become a Chief People Officer? So what was that kind of point in time at which you started to say, I think I can do it. And not only do I think I can do it, but I want to do it. Because lots of folks will consider the role and they're uncertain, right? They've heard it's a challenging role. I think there's data even out there now that says the CHRO role might be the number 2 behind the CEO in terms of the complexity, the breadth and depth that it has to cover. So what was it that kind of led you to decide, I want to become a Chief People Officer?
Well, the big reason for me was really around the impact that you can have, both in terms of the business as well as the people and the culture.
Yeah,
And I know it may sound quite a textbook type of answer, but that really was, for me, an important goal that I wanted to achieve. And there was a couple of points throughout the career because I'd moved between generalist roles and centers of
sure.
expertise. And at one point, and maybe some of the listeners would have this conversation as well with some of the business leaders that they may be servicing, that you may even be asked or invited to work in an operational role in a
Yeah,
business line. And I had that question raised to me by one of the business leaders I was supporting,
yeah,
saying, look, Michael, if you want to really be an outstanding chief people officer, actually, you should actually go and work in the line for a year or two. That never happened for me, but that could have been another path. But this point about becoming a chief people officer, on this point around business impact and impact on culture, I really found that there are a number of people that I worked for, and I thought, my gosh, that is such an important role. And if I get an opportunity, I'd love to have a go at it.
yeah. Well, and so many organizations will have a statistic that says something like 80% of the P&L is people, right? It's the labor who is providing those goods and services to their customers. They're innovating, they're selling, they're responding to customer inquiries, they're ultimately delivering on those business outcomes. And the chief people officer is responsible for all of it, right? It's responsible for the workforce in collaboration with the C-suite.
And I think that's a really important point, Kyle. I mean, this point around context and relevance. So, what distinguishes different HR professionals is those that really throw themselves into what is happening from an economic, geopolitical environment, business
Yeah,
context, and then translate that into the human capital strategy and really think about what are the implications here? What do we need to do to help support, drive the business forward? That is really a big differentiator versus just providing a headcount report.
right.
It really has changed over the last few years, are really around this whole aspect about relevance and context.
Yeah. Well, and I'll pick on a phrase that you just used, which was the human capital strategy, right? It's not an HR function strategy. It's here's the business objectives that the organization's trying to tackle, and here's the human capital or talent workforce strategy needed to meet that, right? And of course, the HR function will do things in support, but you're talking language of the business in terms of here's the human capital strategy for the enterprise.
Yes, absolutely. Even the way that we describe culture, I mentioned earlier to you in one of the breakout sessions, but this whole notion about is culture an asset or a liability? And even using that language,
Yeah.
because quite often culture is seen as one of the soft subjects, but it's
Right.
actually one of the most critical topics that boards and senior executives are focused on
Yeah.
because get the culture right and it's going to drive a lot of success for the business in terms of
Absolutely.
the right sales outcomes, the right focus on operational effectiveness. If you get it wrong, it can create a lot of harm
Yep.
as well. And so that's why it's such an important topic. And the way that you frame things has to be done in the language of business.
Yeah. Well, and Michael, let's maybe use that. You've had the tremendous opportunity to be in the role for a while. Let's start early days in the role. What were some of the things when you stepped into it that you're like, okay, intellectually, I understood something, but now living in the role itself, I'm like, wow, this is different. This is not what I expected. Or here's things that I'm being asked to do that there was no way to get ready other than to get into the role and then learn and grow in tandem with the C-suite and board.
Yeah. So my handover was like 2 weeks from my predecessor. So it was very, very brief. And so at that point, I still hadn't had exposure to the board or the comp committee. So it was like really literally throwing me into the deep end.
Yeah.
But that ability just to be curious and to learn and to be surrounded by a really strong team as well made a huge difference. But I think the big learnings for me in the first 6 months or so, one was around really understanding how board dynamics and
Sure.
compensation committee, those aspects are really important for a newly appointed CHRO
Yep.
on how that whole governance aspects works. But then the second piece is really around, okay, now that you are there at the table as the CHRO, you're no longer just representing your function.
Yep.
You're representing the whole enterprise. And so sometimes you're having to bring back bad news to your own team,
Yeah.
because whatever your team is actually thinking they'd love to do, it's not really the priority for the enterprise.
Sure.
And so you have to then recalibrate expectations as well. So that's sort of the other aspect as well in terms of the learning. You may be extremely enthusiastic about a particular topic or theme that
Yep.
you want to introduce, but there's so many other agendas and priorities from a business perspective that will require the focus and attention for you and your team as well.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I think is so important for folks is that takeaway from what you just shared is that CHROs, chief people officers, are constantly in this tension for what are the things that I do to transform my function or do for my function? What are the things I'm being asked to do for the enterprise? And are we making sure that the things we're doing in the function are in service of the enterprise, right? And sometimes the enterprise will just say, no, like, we understand you want to do that, but we don't need you to do that right now, right? And so, Michael, how did you navigate some of that with the C-suite to make sure at all times the things that you were prioritizing, not only from a human capital strategy for the enterprise, but for your own HR function strategy, that those were always aligned to kind of the business objectives and outcomes that Mastercard as a whole was aiming to achieve?
Yeah, so very early on, I developed a people strategy, which you would think that organization would be the most obvious place to start. But the idea of the people strategy was really to make sure that how I articulated what was important actually made sense for the business.
Okay.
So as an example, as we started to diversify our own business and focusing more than just the core products that we have in the organization, but beginning to expand in different markets around the world, working with governments, central banks, working with digital players as well, and partnerships, we had to also change the profile of talent that we're recruiting. And so therefore, historically, our recruitment pool would be from financial services, banks, and other financial institutions. But we started to widen the aperture and say, look, actually, to do what we need to do, we need to recruit people from retail, from government, from consulting, from tech companies. And that is where you actually begin to build the relevance in terms of how we're supporting the business strategy. So that's sort of one example. The other one was around, we were also going through a lot of acquisition. And so building up that muscle on M&A, how you do due diligence, how you do the integration, what are the risk factors that you look for when you're acquiring a company, how do you sustain it? All of those things are really important. So the people strategy is like the blueprint that allows you then to prioritize what's important for the function, but also for the business. And so when it comes to every year then reviewing what is it that you've achieved or not achieved, sometimes the points would be, hey, I really want to introduce a new talent acquisition system or a new learning management system. You may be able to do one, but not all of them. And this just ensures that you have this discipline around having this multi-year focus rather than just trying to rush everything where there's no relevance, and ensuring that you're able to tweak the people strategy depending on the context of how the environment may be changing.
So, Michael, you were in the chief people officer role for a number of years, and a lot happened in the world during that time, and that's probably a massive understatement. And all of that also brings change to the role itself, to the role, to the function. So can you share maybe what are some of 2 or 3 of the things that you saw change during your time in role that you think is becoming more commonplace for chief people officers in terms of whether that's scope or focus areas or things that aspiring CHROs out there need to think about as they consider their own path eventually to the role?
Well, I think one, you mentioned at the beginning that, chief people officers, chief human resources is becoming almost like the number 2 or 3 in an organization. And if you think about the pandemic, the whole health situation that we had, this was the moment for CHROs. The financial crisis with the CFOs, and this was really the CHROs where they had to really step up. And I think the one word I would use for CHROs, you're almost like a risk manager. You're having to really think about what are the potential risks and how am I going to mitigate them. So if you think about the current climate where we're talking about tariffs or policy changes that may be happening as well, you're having to constantly think about what's the implication for my culture? What does it mean for our business? What are the investors thinking about our company, what we're doing? And I think that's one lens that when I first started as a CHRO, that probably wasn't in the top 10, but it really has elevated, I think, over the last few years. So risk management, I
Yeah.
think, is a really important part. The second piece, I think, is really around being technologically savvy as well.
Yep.
So clearly you haven't asked me yet about AI, but I know it's coming. But this is the moment. I mean,
Yeah.
you cannot close your eyes and just think that this is going to pass. No, we're fully immersing in it. And I think CHROs need to be partnering with their business leaders, with their technology leads, and really be part of the evolution that's happening, both in terms of the way work is done from a productivity perspective, but how you're thinking about transforming your own processes and your own operations from an HR perspective as well. So that's sort of number two. And then the third one, which I think is a really important one, it gets back to the culture. With everything that's happening and our workforces are evolving, most of us are working in multi-generational workforces. Quite often we've got workforces that are quite distributed. You may have a hybrid workforce, you may have remote, you may have all in office, but whatever you have, you need to think about what are you doing in terms of your culture and scaling culture and making sure that you've got the right systems in place that has culture as an asset, not a liability, is a really important area of focus that has to continue to be a top priority for CHROs around the world.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing those three. Maybe what we'll do is we'll link number 2 and number 3 for kind of the next question, right? The topic of AI and automation and culture, because I had the chance to hear you and one of your other colleagues in February, and he stood up and talked about the way in which Mastercard as a company uses AI and automation capabilities in service of customers, right? Fraud prevention, fraud detection, things along those lines. So I'm sure that already has an implication for a culture, right? You have to think about technology in innovative ways. How is it changing the role for how you're just serving your customers? And then that probably turns to internal, right? In terms of if you're going to use AI and automation for the HR function, the finance function, other functions, well, if it's part and parcel of how you're serving your end customers, people better be willing to embrace it internally. So can you share a little bit about maybe your own journey as chief people officer leading maybe the internal adoption and rollout of AI and automation, whether for the function or for the enterprise? And how did you link that to some of your cultural values?
Yeah, so the business, as you mentioned, has always had an element of AI embedded in there just because of the trillions of dollars and trillions of transactions that flow through our rails every year. It's important to be able to understand what is happening and ensuring that there's nothing bad that's happening as well in terms of cybersecurity breaches and so forth. But from an enterprise perspective, there are two use cases. One is around thinking about the operations of HR. So we've implemented AI and machine learning tools a number of years ago with automating some of the basic processes.
Sure.
So as it relates to scheduling candidate interviews and making that a much better experience, both for the hiring managers, for HR, and for the candidate themselves. So something very simple and very basic, but that has helped in terms of productivity and, as I mentioned, from an experience perspective. Then you take it to another level, which is around, we launched a few years ago an internal talent marketplace.
Okay.
And I think here is another great use case as we think about workforce planning, but doing it at scale.
Yeah.
And this is where you have on the one side, on the supply side, you've got talent. So we have about 90% of our workforce now that have uploaded their profile onto this platform. And then you've got the demand side, which is the managers who are basically putting the projects and activities that they want to have access to talent that have some capacity all around the world.
Yeah.
And that matching happens because of the way that the algorithms are set up on this internal marketplace. Now, this isn't just a technology solution. This is also a behavioral and mindset shift as well. So convincing managers that we're now going to democratize access to talent from around the world. Some managers found it very difficult up front because they said, I've got someone who's got sales targets that they have to achieve, and now you're freeing up, or they're freeing up their time to work on projects. We're saying, look, there has to be some level of self-discipline And ultimately, part of the rules of the game is that the individual is responsible for meeting their core objectives.
Right.
But if they do have some capacity and they're interested in working in a project, why not? Because if you don't allow them to do that, they may walk out the door. And so we've seen significant success in terms of retention, upskilling, reskilling, and also deployment and career satisfaction as well as a result of this. And so this is another really great example of the use of AI and machine learning, because if we were to do it in the days before AI, you need a whole team to be able to do this manually. So there are a couple of examples, and I do see that the next step that we're piloting is really the coach in a pocket.
Sure.
So we've been doing a lot of investment in executive development. There are tools and platforms now where we can provide all of our people leaders with the ability to use an online coach, which has got a large language model that allows them to prompt it with particular situations, a difficult conversation they may go into, and they can play it out very harmlessly, practice it with their online coach, and then be able to have that conversation without necessarily having to sit down with a real coach, right? And we still use real coaches per se, but in these particular cases where we're trying to do it at scale, these tools are very helpful for that.
Those are some tremendously tangible examples for folks to consider. And I not only know because I've seen, but I can imagine many organizations doing something like a talent marketplace. One of the first challenges they grapple with is, how do you actually let managers get comfortable with letting their workers deploy time elsewhere, right? But I think one of the things that organizations, to your point on leaning into culture, there's data that would say that internal mobility tends to mean people are faster in terms of time to productivity on other tasks. They already know where the tools are, or the data, or they know the people, they know the business objectives, right? Versus, oh, let's go get a contingent worker, or we need a net new hire who's got then some time to ramp, right? So there's all these other business outcomes that can be driven that maybe gets managers a little bit more comfortable of letting go, as long as, to your point, the original core business objectives are getting met.
Correct.
So, Michael, you've now kind of made it and transitioned, which congratulations, by the way, on the transition to your successor. But you've seen a lot in terms of the evolution of the role, evolution of the function. Can you share with your best crystal ball, knowing that the world is constantly changing, what do you think the next 3 to 5 years look like for the HR function? And what are some of the things that your successor is going to have to grapple with the continued evolution of the role and evolution of the function?
But as I see the next 3-5 years in terms of the next opportunities or challenges that are facing CHROs, I think it's in a couple of buckets. One is around continuing to be thinking about and anticipating and potentially even influencing all of the regulatory and geopolitical issues that we're seeing, and what are the impacts of that on the workforce. So things from a regulatory perspective, as an example, we know that around the world, pay transparency laws are coming up, and every company has to comply with them. And I think it's not just about complying. That's, I think, the easy part, but it's really thinking about what is the impact of being transparent with pay at all levels across the organization. Is that going to create internal friction? How are managers going to be prepared to be able to justify particular pay levels for different individuals in the organization? There's a change management aspect that I think has to be managed as well with all of this. So regulatory, geopolitical, I think is going to continue to be a really important area of focus, and the implications from an HR perspective, really important. The second one I would say is the role of the leader. I think continues to be an area that's going to have an even bigger role and influence in the shape of an organization. And so how we think about how we develop junior leaders all the way through to executive leaders as well is such an important aspect. And it's not just the leadership development 101. What I'm talking about more is around, if you think about leadership, there are two dimensions. One is around, I'm a leader and I'm now reached this particular level in the hierarchy. And so I've got this formal authority and I can require you to do something because this is my position. But I think where we're focused on, I think where a lot of organizations need to be thinking as well is around, how do you inspire? So one's require and the other one's inspire. And I think this is about the moral leadership and thinking about ethics and trust in the workplace,
Yeah.
and combining both of them. You can't have one and not the other.
Right.
You still need some level of structure, but you also need to win the hearts and minds of people. And I think that matching is really important. So leadership development and executive development, I think, is going to be really important as well. And then the final one, I believe, is going to continue to be an area of focus. If you think about the culture, well-being aspect, the rising costs of health insurance as well,
Yeah.
I think CHOs are going to have to continue to be very much in touch with what are the latest areas of research as it relates to preventative health, mental well-being, and what support we can provide this multi-generational workforce that may be feeling quite unsettled with all the situations, having to be upskilled. I've got kids that may not want to go to college anymore. There's a whole range of dimensions. And I think this whole aspect about health costs, health insurance, negotiating with your CFO and thinking about preventative health, I think is a really important topic that I think our CHROs are going to continue to focus on.
Absolutely. I even heard a CHRO recently talking about, as part of the future of the function, having more neuroscientists, right, who say, I understand how the brain works, so I can design a workday, work week to help reduce stress so that you're being the most productive self. And so that as stress levels are down, general health, physical and mental well-being is higher. So then you can tie all that to very specific business outcomes. Physical and mental well-being is higher, absenteeism is down, engagement is up, trust is up, productivity is up, revenue per employee is up, right? All those connection points that makes it no longer a soft, hey, well-being is good, but no, this is a meaningful business outcome that we're driving. Well, Michael, maybe final question for you. The role, as you have shared, has changed, kind of where the function might be focusing in the future in terms of the business outcomes it's driving and the human outcomes it's driving is continuing to evolve. For those folks who are considering, contemplating, aspiring to that chief people officer role, where's a place that they should start or something they should consider as deciding, is the journey right for me? Is the role right for me?
Yeah, I think the starting point really is around, think about what you want to be and what role. So your question at the beginning around why did you want to do it? Starting with the question of the why is so important, because once you land on your purpose, then all the answers will be there. And it's not for everybody because these roles are 24/7. You are constantly on call, even though we may pretend that we're not, and we're trying to project some level of balance. If there is a crisis, if there is a situation, you can't just hold off. You have to dive in. So, and it's not for everyone. So that's a really important question, really determining your why and your purpose. Once you've determined if this is the path you want, then I think the other aspect is around two things. One is around just being curious and having the aperture as wide as possible and to learn and to absorb as much as possible. I just do a lot of reading and connect with a lot of, whether it's business, now it's arts as well. So there's research around the importance of bringing arts into your thinking and what that does to your mind and creativity. But I think reading is really important and just being curious constantly. And the final thing is networking. Like, it sounds very trite, but I spend probably 30% of my time with my peers, just having coffee, or there may be dinners that are organized, but just being able to hear what's happening in different industries, how people are dealing with particular issues, sharing is such an important aspect. And it's so important that at that point where you may be stuck and these jobs are very lonely, the fact that you can pick up the phone and call a friend and say, hey, I'm dealing with this, how should I be thinking about it, is such an important aspect. And so networking is also a really important aspect of this.
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons that we convene folks here at Deloitte University once a year, is so that across industries and sectors, they're able to meet peers who are grappling with workforce development, talent development, ahead of the organizations, really make sure that they're doing the right thing for the humans in the business, driving those business outcomes. So, Michael, thank you so much, not only for being here at Deloitte University for the program, but for joining us on Capital H. Listeners, I hope you took some great insights from Michael, from his journey to the Chief People Officer role, his lessons learned in the role, and where he thinks the function is headed. Stay tuned for more from Deloitte University. Michael, thank you again for joining.
Thank you, Kyle. All the best.
This podcast is produced by Deloitte. The views and opinions expressed by podcast speakers and guests are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of Deloitte. This podcast provides general information only and is not intended to constitute advice or services of any kind. For additional information about Deloitte, please go to deloitte.com/about.